All right, so we're working on chapter 2.2 of the biology unit. Here's a quick review of mitosis. It says, using page 84, try and remember the different parts of mitosis. We didn't go over that, so I'm going to skip that section. What we're going to work on is the topic 2.2, and this is looking at inheritance. So the first term here is selective breeding. Selective breeding is choosing individuals with useful characteristics to produce a more desirable plant or animal stock. So selective breeding is basically selecting who you want to mate. So if I want to have golden retriever puppies, then I'm going to choose a male and a female golden retriever puppy, or dog, to mate. So you're choosing the characteristics that you want and putting them together to breed. This could also happen in plants, so we could pick certain plants like, ooh, I like this type of plant because it looks this way, and use their pollen to cross it with another plant that you have specific traits you want. And inheritance, it says the first ideas about inheritance came from selective breeding. People chose the characteristics they wanted in their offspring and bred only those plants or animals. So an example here shows parents. So a strong maternal instinct would be the mother on the left there, and then the father has a high growth rate. We bring those two together, and these are the possible offspring. So we've got an average maternal instinct with high growth rate, average maternal instinct with average growth rate, strong maternal instinct with high growth rate, and strong maternal instinct average growth rate. So then we look at all those that are all of the offspring, I guess, is what it has looked at. It's looked at all of them. And then we choose the one that has the best characteristics, which is this one. And then we would use that one to further breed. So we would use that one and then breed it with another cow, and then keep going and going to select for the best offspring. Oops. So discovering genes, well, genes were not always known. The guy who figured out genes, or the word genes, or that thing that we pass on from one generation to the next, was Gregor Mendel. So he came up with the first explanation for why certain traits are passed on by observing pea plants. So he figured all of this out about genes looking at pea plants. Mendel decided to use the pea plants at first because they were easy to grow in large numbers, so you could grow them really fast, and their reproduction could be manipulated. So we can say this pea will cross with this pea, basically by cross-pollinating. So what he did was he took like a little paintbrush and took the pollen off of one plant and placed it on the other plant. So he was the one that sort of made them cross to get to make the offspring that he wanted. So this was a true selective breeding process. Mendel transferred pollen from one plant to another, and he called this cross-pollination. He also allowed some plants to self-pollinate or self-fertilize. That's sort of cut off there, but what we're talking about here is self-pollination can happen in plants. It can't happen in humans. You mate with yourself. And basically what that does is it creates a clone. Because you're going to only pass on the genes that you have to your offspring, so self-pollination would create an exact copy. What Mendel noticed when he did some of his research, he noticed that purple flowers or white flowers were what was created on the pea plants. There was also round seeds or wrinkled seeds, and there was yellow seeds or green seeds. So there was 3 different traits here. The first trait was color. The second one was, I guess, texture. And the third one was, well, the color as well. So this is color of seeds, and this is color of flower. So we noticed those 3 different traits that were expressed in the pea plants. So he decided to use those sort of traits to figure out some things about the pea plants. So some conclusions from his pea plant experiments. The inheritance of traits must be determined by factors that are now called genes. So in order to have a certain trait, you must have got it from a gene that you got from your parent. Individuals randomly inherit one factor or one gene from each parent. So you randomly get one gene from your mom, one gene from your dad for a specific trait. Genes are independently passed on to the offspring. This means that a pea plant's inheritance of a gene that makes it have purple flowers does not affect the plant's inheritance on other traits such as seed color. So everything, all of them are randomly, individually passed on. It's not, if you have purple flowers, you're going to be more likely to have wrinkled peas. That's not the case. Your flower color has no weight on any of the other traits, so that's independent. This is really important. This is something that always comes up on the diploma. I know you guys won't write a diploma, but it's independent assortment. And then some genes are more powerful than others, so a trait may not appear in an individual because the more powerful gene masks it. For example, purple flowers over white flowers, but it can still be passed on to the individual's offspring. So what that means is dominance. And I'm gonna write that here. Continuing on where we left off before, so we were talking about Mendel and his experiments on peas and how they were concluding basically different traits of the peas. And then we found out that there's dominant genes or dominant traits that will mask the less dominant ones. They show us an example here of round peas being crossed with wrinkled peas, and all of the offspring become round. So by looking at that, we know that round would be dominant over wrinkled peas. So then we took those round peas and we crossed them with round peas. So we crossed them with each other. We ended up getting a little bit of a different thing showing up. So we got some round peas, the dominant, and then we got a quarter of them being wrinkled. So by doing this experiment, he realized that, okay, there's not just one gene, there's one from each parent, and even though you look like you're dominant on the outside, you might have one of those not dominant genes being masked. So I call that, masked. And there's a word for that, and I don't know if it's going to be on the next slide. Okay. It's 2 slides from now. We'll get there. So our traits, it says they're acquired traits during a person's lifetime because of experiences, education, and upbringing, such as a scar from a cut, of the ability to speak a certain language, or I'm guessing that's supposed to say. So acquired traits are things that you acquire over your lifetime, where inherited traits are traits that are genetically passed on from one generation to the next, such as a certain blood type or eye color. So something that You can't change over your lifetime. It's what you're born with. So on here they've got the word alleles, and I was just looking to see exactly what they're meaning by this. But alleles are basically just different forms of the gene. And when we're talking about peas, for instance, we use letters to represent the different traits. So if we're talking about round versus wrinkled, then we would use different letters basically to identify it, and those letters are considered alleles. So for a round, you can pick any letter really, and the letter I'm going to choose is, I'll pick R. So a big R signifies that it's dominant. So for round seeds, they could be big R, or they could be big R, little r. And why they could be big R, little r is because this big R right here will mask this little r. So even though on its gene level it'll look like big R, little r, what we'll see with our eyes is round. Now wrinkled, there's only one possibility. If you're wrinkled, you have nothing to mask. So you would have to be little r, little r. So once you don't have that big R in there to mask, that dominant trait isn't there, then you're gonna see wrinkled peas. So these little letters that identify that are known as alleles. Okay, so this is an allele and this is an allele. And the different alleles will signify basically whether you have a dominant or recessive trait. Okay, something that people might sometimes do is they might write, well, this is big R for wrinkled and this is W for round and wrinkled. We need to always keep the same letter. So if we're talking about the same trait, whether you're round or wrinkled, so smooth or wrinkled is really what it is, sort of the texture of it, then you're going to use only one letter, so the big form and the little form. If you start changing letters, then we're going to think you're talking about a totally different trait, like color, for instance, and that's not how we do it. So we need to always keep that same letter. I don't care what letter you use as long as you're being consistent. And normally we just use the letter that represents the trait that's dominant. So round starts with R, we'll use an R. So it gives you an example. Consider the trait like your thumb. One allele creates a straight thumb, while the other creates a hitchhiker thumb. So that's that one that we saw in the last lesson, looking at your thumb or looking at your tongue. Remember that little activity? So if we had a straight thumb as being big S and a hitchhiker thumb as being little s, then we would think that straight thumb is dominant over hitchhiker thumb. And basically you have a trait from your mom and a trait from your dad, and those two together form what you would look like having a straight thumb or a hitchhiker. Okay, here's some terms. These are pretty important. I'm surprised that they didn't talk about these yet. These are the terms that explain all of the different things about traits. I've already used the word dominant. So something is dominant. There we go. And then the word recessive. So something that's recessive is something that's not dominant. So a dominant allele is something that will show up, the trait will show up. Where a not dominant allele, also known as recessive, you'll show the recessive trait. So I did go over this before, but here if we were going to do this, This would be the recessive traits. This is recessive. And then the other ones are our dominants. And that's what the alleles would look like. So the bigger letters are dominant, the smaller letters are the recessive trait. Homozygous, it says your two alleles are the same, two dominant or two recessive. So what it means to be homozygous is that you have the same alleles. So if we look at these ones above, these are both the same, these are both the same, so those would be considered homozygous, okay? These two, not the same, they have two different letters. They would be known as heterozygous, okay? So homozygous, I always tell people homo, if you know the word homo, it means the same. So homozygous, you could think of homosexual, means you like people of the same sex. If that's what you need to remember that, whatever you need, homozygous, that means the same. Heterozygous means that your two alleles are different, so one dominant and one recessive, and you will show the dominant trait. So even though this one right here is big R, little r, you're going to show whatever the trait is that's big R, because you've got that dominant trait, it's going to mask or overpower that recessive trait, okay? And then the last two here, genotype and phenotype. A genotype is what it looks like at your gene level. So the alleles that you have. So this would be your genotype. And your phenotype would be what it looks like to our eyes. So let's say that's round. If we're talking about peas, the big R signifies round. So big R, little r would mean that it is round.